Aha, alas. Good afternoon. Welcome to A Reason for Hope. My name is Adrian Van Vactor, and I'm here in studio with one of our pastors here at Calvary Christian Fellowship of Tucson, Arizona, Sean Richards.
One of many.
Hey, bro. How you doing?
Good. Good to have you back, too.
Nervous?
Oh, always.
Today's topic is not the reason why I asked that, but that's okay. Welcome to Apologetics Monday. Apologetics Monday. That's right. Apologetics Monday, where we take a laser-focused approach on a specific issue. Sometimes it's biblical in terms of interpretation. Sometimes it's extra biblical in terms of archaeology, history, and so on, things that you wouldn't get directly out of Scripture. But nonetheless, apologetics is to defend the faith, to be ready to give an answer. And sometimes those answers need a little bit more time, not just a quick 5 or 10 minute answer, but a whole program. And today is no different, and I'm glad that Sean invited me to be a part of today's discussion. So hopefully I'll have something contentious to say. I don't know. We'll see. But anyhow, welcome. And if you are new, this is A Reason for Hope. This is a weekday Bible answer program. We take questions from our live stream audience about the historic Christian faith, about the Bible. How do I interpret it? How do I apply it? Do I have good reasons for believing in spiritual things like the existence of God, the existence of angels and demons? Is the Bible really God-breathed? That and many other questions that we've been tackling here on this program. We do this every Monday through Friday, 4 to 5 p.m. Arizona or Mountain Standard Time. And there are multiple ways you can engage with us. We just take it off the cuff, right off the comment sections and the various live streaming platforms that we utilize. For example, you can catch us on YouTube. Our YouTube channel is A Reason for Hope. You can go to youtube.com and hit /@ A Reason, the number 4 Hope. Find us that way. You can also catch us on Facebook. Our Facebook page is Calvary Christian Fellowship of Tucson, Arizona. You can go straight to our page by just going to facebook.com /CCF Tucson. That's CCF TUCSON. That's Tucson, but sounds like or looks like Tucson for those of you who don't live in the in the area, but watching online nonetheless. And of course, you can also catch the program on the X platform by following our senior pastor, who's not here today, obviously. This guy, that's that guy, and the senior pastor is this guy, which is not here. But anyhow, got the sillies today. X.com / well, you could just follow him on Twitter, and his handle on the X platform is Scott R4H. That's Scott with a double T, the letter R, the number 4, the letter H. And whenever we're live, you'll see a little notification. If you're on the mobile app, it's a little buggy asking questions, but we've noticed that when you make a comment, it sort of fades away, so we may not see them. But if you're asking questions on X and it's not working for you, please let us know by either doing a DM or just tweeting out a question and tagging us, and that way we can get to it that way. You can also email us if you, again, if you're on the X platform or perhaps you have a little more detail that you would like to add to your question, maybe some background that you don't want to post on social media. You can just email your questions as well. I'll be checking all these throughout the program. And of course, today is Apologetics Monday. So if you do have a question, it has to be related to the topic. Otherwise, we'll save it for later on in the week. And if we don't get to your question, we save a list of all the questions that get asked each and every day, and we always catch up to them on them the next day, because there are some days we get more questions than others, so we try to just stay on our toes and keep up with that. And usually by the end of the week, we're all caught up on answering most folks' questions. But if you want to answer give us more detail, you can email us, and that email address is questions@areasonforhope.org. That's questions@areason, the number 4, hope.org. If you want to avoid social media altogether, you can go to our website, calvarychristianfellowship.com, and hit that Watch Live tab. It'll take you to our live stream, where we live stream all of our services, including this program, every Monday through Friday. And it's also got a chat box and a little prayer button, so if you want us to send a prayer on your behalf to our prayer team, you can take advantage of that. But that comment box there is in real time, just like any other social media platform, but you don't have to have a social media account. You can go incognito, whatever you want. It's up to you, but as long as the question is sincere, from the heart, and related to the Bible. And that's all we have to say about that.
All right.
Today's topic, Sean, is, drum roll,
Chronology of the Gospels.
Chronology of the Gospels. What that means is which gospel was written first?
Yep. Mark and priority is basically the essence of the question. And obviously, when this gets brought up, it's the little things that skeptics
Yeah.
always make mountains out of molehills. But
Yeah.
obviously, before we say anything,
Yeah, let's take a moment to pray. And like we say on many of these topics, many of these are secondary issues, but are still very important to look into. Certain questions we would never divide fellowship over. We would not say, oh, well, you're not a Christian if you don't believe in this particular historical nuance of this thing. We try to be biblical. That's the important thing. So let's pray and we'll get right into it.
Absolutely. Dad, thank you for the honor you've given Adrian and I to be able to stand by and upon your word and to know that the history around it, while very in-depth and very taxing intellectually, is an opportunity for us to grow by it. And as you promised that it would not return void, we ask that the people listening would profit from the time being spent here, that as skeptics are ultimately putting forward the goal of undermining it, and that churches may gloss over these issues in favor of more favorable ideas. We recognize that any discussion about your word is worthwhile because it bears testimony to your Son, so we ask that he would be honored by the work that is being done in this next hour. We pray this in his name. Amen.
Amen. Thank you, Pastor Sean. So gospel chronology, we kind of just touched on it, but give us kind of a quick definition and probably why you would ask this. Why would we talk about this? Why is this important?
Yeah, like a lot of questions that we get on the broadcast, there's the concern people have about why these books are in our Bibles, and even in this case, in this order. And the reason for that is when they open Genesis and Leviticus, they generally see, okay, this is the flow, the life of Moses, Israel's early days. But you go into Ezra, and suddenly they're coming back from an interaction with Babylon, and they want to know, is this all chronological or not? And chronology is very favorable as far as writing in the West because we like to know just what happened, full scope and picture. But when it comes to Oriental and ancient writing, they didn't necessarily follow that pattern wholesale. For example, Genesis chapter 1 discusses the whole creation of the heavens and the earth. Genesis 2 focuses specifically on details pertaining to the sixth day. And that throws people for a bit because they wonder, okay, so if I read Judges and then Ruth takes place during Judges, but then does that mean that 1 Samuel is different from all this and so forth? That obviously is a warranted question. And this is especially true for the New Testament because when people get confused, this oftentimes leaves them unbalanced and, in the case of spiritual and intellectual warfare, vulnerable. And what do I mean by that? Well, obviously, when it comes to skeptical objections to the Bible, they can just wholesale dismiss, contradict, use even terms that they are themselves misrepresenting or don't understand themselves, and put forward these ideas of little kernels of confusion, saying, well, you know that the church, they put forward Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, but did you know that if they put it in order, it would be Mark, Matthew, Luke, and John? Or, we don't know which John, or we don't know this and that detail, and it leaves people in a place where they are both desperate and curious. And that's a very dangerous combination because people who are desperate aren't picky about their kind of content. It's like someone who's starving isn't going to be as particular about what they eat as someone who's content but considering their next meal. And in the same way for information, when people are thrown these little monkey wrenches and ask the question, well, did you know that the church didn't really get that one right about the Bible? It should naturally lead us into other conversations like, what else did they get wrong about the Bible? Are their books missing? Are the authors false? So on and so forth. And so the best way to stop that avalanche is to catch the early stones, be able to say, not as complicated as they're making it out to be, not as big a deal as they're making it out to be, because as we'll be discussing later regarding the objections, even if we give credence to the idea of Mark in priority, that Mark was the first gospel and the reasons they give for that, then we would have to say, okay, that doesn't really change much of the content of them, though. The life of Jesus' biographies, the fourfold gospel, as it was later called, and even the Didache, putting them into a harmonization later on, was ultimately to communicate the truth about the historical Jesus. And it would mean that he was resurrected. It would mean that he was divine. And by those two truths, we are saved. So this is ultimately why we want to catch these issues. And I thought it was a very good request that was given to us regarding Apologetics Monday, because when it comes down to it, Luke, John, very little debate. But we'll go through that information anyway because we have the opportunity to talk about it. The real debate is whether or not Matthew or Mark was written first and the implications of that. What would mean regarding the testimony and narrative of the Bible if Mark was written first, if there's this quote-unquote development of Christology, if there's this priority of what the church decides as opposed to what the history says, where we're getting our authority from, and being able to kind of cut it off at the pass and say, I think you've been watching a little bit too much of Tom Hanks and not actually read what's being discussed about this. So,
What we're not dealing with, though, is date of writing and early authorship. We completely believe and teach in the early authorship. These are eyewitness accounts attributed to these authors, but that is not what we mean by gospel chronology. We have dealt with that in previous episodes, probably this year, haven't we? Wasn't it this year that we dealt with authorship in terms of date of writing?
yeah, we've done more in detail regarding whether or not these were written at the time they claim to have been. We'll go more into the evidence surrounding the dates and laser precision, but the crux of the issue, the controversy, is Mark and priority.
Go to our YouTube channel and you can do a search and you can find some of the episodes on Apologetics Mondays where in great length was the issue of, do we have evidence for the eyewitness early authorship of the Gospels?
Yeah. So let's start with the latest to the earliest and just understand how we know, not just that these were written at these times, but what reason we have to give them these particular dates. And of course, if that's in mind, if you note the numbers, which one came latest, which one came earliest. So starting with the Gospel of John, we would date that to, and there's debate about this as well, but we would note this as the latest gospel because of the historical data around its author. Most would put it in the late 90s AD, or the year of our Lord. Anno Domini is what that stands for. And the reason for that is because, according to quotes from people who had contact with and who knew associates of the apostles themselves, would date it between the reigns of Domitian and Trajan. And since we know when they reigned, that's when we would put the authorship of this gospel. The data regarding that is, of course, the reports of Irenaeus. Irenaeus, for those of you who weren't with us in our study on the existence of the Apostle John, he was a student of John himself. Polycarp, of course, we have one of his letters to the church of Philippi, was the mentor of this guy Irenaeus, and he tended to write more about the background of the people he learned from, while Polycarp just shared the message, and that, I think, is worth noting. We also have confirmation of Irenaeus's points through Justin Martyr's dialogue with Trypho. We'll read them through when we get there. Origen, who is a later early church father, not the best in terms of his ideas, but at least in the points he brought up, they were interesting. He gives a commentary on the Gospel of John and Revelation and provides background that we don't have reason to contradict. And of course, this was all compiled by the first church historian, whose name was Eusebius. The evidence of this, again, is centered largely around as early testimony as possible. If you're closer to the source, then you have a less risk involved of them being altered or adjusted for the sake of sensationalism or popularity. They just had to stick to the facts because the people who knew them were still alive. Multiple attestation, as we've oftentimes mentioned, double dissimilarity, having more than one person say the same basic thing, it's all asking those kind of questions. And when it comes to ancient history, if you have a claim about history, this was written at this time, if you have more than one person saying the same basic details, as long as it's in writing and authentic, then that is what's going to give us absolutely a reason to believe this is what they're saying. And we also have archaeological confirmation of John writing during the time of Trajan because we have temples dedicated to him in Pergamos, which were noting Caesar worship and fit to the timeline that John was writing in, and Ephesus, the city that John was writing in, also being a flourishing city by the time of the turn of the 2nd century. So you have right people, right places, right times, all affirming these truths, that it fits what's being discussed here. Let's start again with you think, the most direct of these instances, and we'll revisit this quote for the others. In ecclesiastical history, the writings of Origen said, "The first written was that according to the one-time tax collector, but later apostle of Jesus Christ, Matthew, who published it for believers from Judaism, composed in Hebrew characters, and second, that according to Mark, composed as Peter guided. Third, that according to Luke, the gospel praised by Paul, composed from those who are for those from the Gentiles, and finally, that according to John." Now, if you want to know the chronology of our Gospels today, he's the earliest one to lay out that chronology there. But Irenaeus' report would also fall in line with this, and we could mention the Dialogue of Trypho, just like we did in our study on John. But Irenaeus' report is as straightforward as they come. He wrote, "John, the disciple of the Lord, who leaned back on his breast," that's a reference to the Gospels, "published the Gospel while he was resident at Ephesus in Asia." So we have a place that actually existed at this time and region. Asia is referring to modern-day Turkey. They called it Asia Minor in the 1st through 3rd centuries. But before the time of Ataturk as well. But the idea of all of this being put forward is, notice our handling of these quotes. These claims that are being made regarding chronology are closer to the event than just the theories that we could presuppose today. And because Irenaeus had more connections to John than we would, we could take his claims at face value, but also examine them. And because there was, in fact, a city like Ephesus standing at the time, that reinforces it. Because of writings that John was making during a time of Christian persecution, it shows that it got that fact right, for all intents and purposes, when John was discussing his persecution. And when we note that alongside the book of Revelation, which John claims to have written during the time of Domitian, we also note that he composed the gospel according to people who were there, as opposed to today where it would be who knew someone who knew someone who knew someone who knew someone who knew someone. That, of course, wouldn't hold up in court or in conversation for that matter. But when it comes to those quotes from these early church fathers and examining their quotes with archaeology, that is what would lead us to the conclusion that we would have every reason to believe John is the latest gospel, written according to the people who knew him, the writings of their students, and the ongoing consensus of Christians for the following 2 centuries. We also note, again, verification that these students gave that we can test today. So whether it's, and this is where the debate largely stands, they would put it in the late 70s to the early 90s. That's where you can examine whether or not Irenaeus got it right about Trajan and Domitian being when he died and when he was being persecuted. But saying that is neither here nor there, because no one would put the Gospels that late as far as the synoptics, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. So John is definitely noted as the last, and that's why we mentioned as the 4th. I think that's completely worth leaving as is.
Yeah, and one of the things to point out, and this could be a challenge to a later date of the Gospel of John, not necessarily the book of Revelation, but the fact that none of the Gospels mention the destruction of the temple, and they're writing stories about the significance of the temple, the significant role that Jesus played in putting an end to sacrifice and so on. You would think that they would mention at least a reference to there not being a temple, if these were all written much later, like as some of the Jesus Seminar guys would say that this was all compiled, or if you made reference to the Da Vinci Code films or books, very popular, deceived a lot of people. They thought, oh well, this is what really happened. The Bible was collected and written hundreds of years later. Again, if someone had been doing that, they would have made mention of the destruction of the temple, which one of the most significant events in Jewish history, post the birth of Jesus, next to them becoming a nation again in the 40s.
Yeah, and with the Gospel of John, obviously, we see why there's no mention of it. The argument for the later dates is that is ancient history as far as things are concerned, 20 years around its past and 3 dynasties. But the idea of John drawing attention to that wasn't the point of the Gospel. According to Irenaeus, the reason the Gospel was composed in the first place was to answer questions about specific deity claims that Jesus made.
Which is why you see a lot more emphasis on the deity of Christ in the Gospel of John.
Yeah, it's a series of conversations that he
Yeah.
had with people rather than specific historical events or even
Yeah.
miracles. We do see miracle claims in the Gospel of John, but ironically, the one with the highest Christology has the fewest number of miracles.
Yeah, and you mentioned this, but it bears repeating because this is why this is important. Skeptics want to maintain that the gospel is not just a set of eyewitness accounts. Different people at the scenes of an accident reporting their perspective, their take on what happened, all historically reliable, yet pointing out different details and sometimes pointing them out in a different order, but nonetheless factual details of historical events. Their claim, the skeptics' claim, is no, this stuff was all made up much later, that the Jesus of faith is not the same as Jesus of history, and therefore we have to concoct reasons or motivations, biases, to why you have certain, like for example, one of the motivations for arguing for Mark and priority, the idea that Mark was written first, is that, oh, well, see, you notice in Mark there's a lot less miracles, there's a lot less emphasis on just there's details in there that seems like a toned down version of what really happened. And then as you go on to the other ones, they expand. And so the argument is, see, the gospel did evolve. These are accretions over time. This isn't just four people witnessing something. And so we're countering those arguments because they're incorrect, first of all, but that's why this issue, did I say that right? That's pretty much why this issue bears talking about, because we're not just arguing about who came first, the chicken or the egg. We're trying to also at the same time diffuse a very not new list of arguments that suggest that no, Christianity is an evolution of ideas, not based on a real person in history. And so that's why this is a very important issue.
Yeah, because if I were to say compare it to neo-paganism or something like that, they were coming from cultures and have writings that were very fluid, and we can demonstrate that from the text. But if we compare that to the gospel, you don't just equivocate and say all religions function this way. Now let's go on to the next conversation. We say one of your premises is already false, and we need to make sure that you understand very different culture in Jewish society, even if it does have Gentile influence, as opposed to carte blanche Gentile writings, where we can actually prove evolution of ideas and absorption of different cultures. So let's make sure that we're understanding what we're talking about. If these groups of individuals were able to reference not only what they understood much closer to the event, that we have more than one person saying the same basic details, and that, of course, that is what's reflected in the text today, then people who argue that detail's not right is saying, do you even know why that detail's included? And they say, well, Mark is shorter, therefore it came first. That's completely ridiculous. We need to examine the evidence, not make an assumption that shorter means sooner. I can write, I can write,
Some argue that because of its brevity that makes Mark a likely candidate to be written first. But the stories in Mark are longer.
And the quota of verse to miracle ratio is actually larger than that of Matthew and Luke. So,
and again, we're at the one hand diffusing the argument that the whole of the New Testament of who Jesus is, who God is, how he revealed himself, is something that was made up by non-eyewitnesses over time. That's the argument we're trying to diffuse. Once we've arrived at no, these are real eyewitness accounts, we can definitely have a healthy debate about which gospel may have been actually in the early church written first, and probably even come to different conclusions without doing damage to the other problem.
And when we get to Mark, I'm going to give full credence in noting my personal view is that they were written very soon. Between each other. And it's ultimately just a view about whether or not your handling of Acts chapters 12 to 15 is, of course, something that Peter put quickly into circulation or something he discipled Mark on a little bit before Matthew started a trend. But here's the point. It doesn't change the substance of the information. It's only put forward in order to start off or knock over bigger issues down the hill. And we don't want to entertain that because the agenda is not only false, but the claim itself that starts the whole problem is also false.
And the other thing we're not doing is, well, just to explain the language, we may say things like different orders, redactions, additions. When we're using that language, this isn't at all intended to call into question the historical reliability of the Gospels, their inerrancy, or their inspiration. We believe wholeheartedly. Some will call it the Chicago Statement of inerrancy, and but we wholeheartedly believe that Scripture is. We believe in the plenary inspiration of Scripture. We believe that it's all God-breathed and it's inerrant and it's historically reliable in all that it asserts. So, in its original autograph. So that's not called in question. But because there are 4 Gospels, we have to look at them in a practical way. 4 different eyewitness accounts from different perspectives. Some will highlight certain stories that others did not. So there are some stories that are in some of the Gospels that are not in the others. There are some stories that are a bit shorter. There are some details that are added. And that's typical and normal, and you would expect to see that in historical narrative. These aren't books. We do not claim that the Bible fell from heaven, or that Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John were, gold tablets that fell from the sky and they just simply had to circulate them on paper. We believe that these were real humans. If you understand the doctrine of inspiration, it's real humans with real human thoughts and real human agendas being guided along by God so that what they assert theologically and historically is 100% error-free, but while reserving or preserving the humanness of the text, meaning that this was actually written by a real human being who's being guided along and inspired by God. This isn't a divine message in the sense that God's just dictating. So that's important. Now, there are times where God does dictate in the Bible, but those are pretty clear. And so we don't want to, make it sound like we're denying those things by saying things like, well, Mark didn't include that, or Matthew didn't really include that part of the story. That doesn't in any way call into question these essential doctrines.
No, not at all. And when it comes to the conversation, again, we're dealing with a small issue, so it doesn't become a bigger issue when these presumptions are made. So let's get into the synoptics. That's, of course, referring to Matthew, Mark, and Luke, since they followed more of a biographical format. Luke, of course, is who we would put third in line. That's dated to the late 50s to the early 60s, and especially leaning towards the 60s because of the reign of the Emperor Nero. Now, the data that would support this being not just a document that was originally intended in court to explain to Nero what Paul's claims were regarding the Jewish Messiah. He wasn't versed on every single religion under his rule, and of course needed this to be made apparent to him. Acts has even been treated as a legal briefing composed by Luke to explain everything that had happened up until this point. But the start of the Gospel of Luke cites that eyewitnesses were his source material, thus still alive. Now, noting then that when Luke is putting in order, and let me just read the passage here in a second, but pre-existing material, that implies that something was written before this that he wanted to put in a better order or sanitize for his audience, which was named Theophilus. Now, I say was named Theophilus, not who was named Theophilus, because there is some debate about whether it was a group, lovers of God, that's what Theophilus means, and Theophilus being referring to an individual. But it says in verse 1, inasmuch as many, so notice more than one, have taken in hand to set in order a narrative of those things which have been fulfilled among us, just as those who were from the beginning were eyewitnesses and ministers of the word delivered them to us. So he's already describing that of the eyewitnesses circulating material about the fulfillment of the things he's about to discuss. He said, it seemed, verse 3, good to me also, having a perfect, literally complete understanding of all things from the very first, to write to you an orderly account, most excellent Theophilus, that you may know the certainty of those things in which you were instructed. So speaking to fellow Christians, he is putting these things in order. Now, what are the things? Well, things are there. The there things would put at least one, definitely more given the language, which is why they put it third in line for the authoritative gospel accounts regarding the needs of these things. Now, the need, of course, for this information to be accessible to a non-Jewish audience was accommodating developments later in church history. If you read the book of Acts, you'd note that the chronology of events in church history started with the church being majority Jewish. And obviously the controversy of non-Jewish people entering into belief in the Jewish Messiah was actually the first heresy that needed to be addressed in the church by Jews themselves. The first council of Jerusalem in Acts was convened in order to address whether or not Jews or non-Hebrews needed to become Jewish and observe ceremonial laws like circumcision, new moon, Sabbaths, and so forth. And these things were soundly addressed unanimously by all the apostles and even confirmed by miracles. But we don't just have that to note the narrative that Luke is being set regarding its date. Because if you've read, for example, the history behind the book of Acts, and we'd be happy to go through that as well at a later date, Acts is without a doubt the most historically rich book of the New Testament because of its reference to the Roman Empire, which we have more information about in modern history than any other ancient civilization, bar maybe some of those that are pretty recent. But when it comes to the names, the dates, even the titles of when these people were ruling in these specific places and specific times, there's even an instance in the city of Corinth, Philippi, and many others of titles that were attributed to a very specific individual at a specific time and only for 1 year. And Luke gets that detail right. So the historians that don't just throw this out on principle or out of a bias to, of course, not accept evidence when they're supposed to follow it, they note that is when this particular chapter was being documented by Luke because he got all the details right. Details about, of course, trade routes that were being used actively at this time and were accessible to Roman technology. We have individuals that we also know existed like Felix or Porcius Festus and many others whose reigns from 52 to 62 collectively set for us kind of the capstone of when Paul would have either been under house arrest in Rome or was spending time for a year or so in Ephesus and Corinth in order to give Luke the opportunity to write these things down. So the earlier days would be in the late 50s, and that would be because of these very narrow margins for error as far as the details Luke wrote down in Acts. We also note the opportunity Luke would have had to have not only produced but circulated books like the Gospel of Luke while Paul was under house arrest for a full year in Rome. And that's where ultimately historians are asking, do you have the means, access to papyrus or vellum, the motive, of course, a desire for Christians to put these things in order, which Luke himself expressed at the opening of the gospel, and the opportunity. Were there times where they were more on the run and Luke was kind of like scribbling things down on his tablet or so forth, or were they able to chill out, had an environment where this resource was available and the opportunity to do so? That's where we get those events. Now, the timelines, of course, being set within the year of these things taking place are where we use these historical landmarks. They didn't use the Gregorian calendar because it postdates them by over 1,000 years. But the internal evidence examining other books, other writings of Luke, like the book of Acts, are where we want to start. But just like we did with the Gospel of John, it's not where we want to end. Is there any external evidence for this kind of timeline for when the Gospel of Luke would have been written? We obviously note that there was a limit to when Luke would have had the best opportunity to write the gospel account. Paul's execution was reported during the reign of Nero by Eusebius, and that would be the time cap for when Luke, who would have accompanied Paul, and according to 2 Timothy, his last letter, was with him. And people would either say, was he executed alongside him? Was he set free and then wrote the gospel later on? That needs to be verified. But noting then that this would be a kind of soft barrier would show that he was active in Christian circles, and you can't be active if your head is in one place and your body in another. So that's the argument. We have a historical event, and there are others, but noting when Luke would have had the most opportunity to gather with the eyewitnesses, the majority of the eyewitnesses would have been still alive, and of course during a time, or in a place rather, where he had access to writing material and could circulate it. And as we also mentioned before, there's the absence of relevant information. Notice we say 50s to 60s, not 70s. Why? Because Luke, being a biographical source and emphasizing In particular, Jesus' prediction of the destruction of the Temple of Jerusalem is not mentioned in the Gospel of Luke. The scattering of the Hebrews, which was fulfilled in the Old Testament, which Luke himself says, the things which were fulfilled among us, he has that agenda in mind. The timelines, again, that are narrowing down when these things would have been taking place, regarding, say, for example, a modern comparison, if you did a biography of the history of the Twin Towers in New York City, and there's no mention of the 9/11 attacks, that would either conclude the person writing this is incompetent, it's a very important detail, or this was written before September 11th, 2001. That's the kind of information we're handling here. Now, Nero, also worth mentioning, in Acts as well as Luke, isn't mentioned as a hostile figure towards Christianity yet, which of course was a very radical change in his, I guess, say, foreign policy right after his first appeal before Paul. And of course, when it comes to him not even being in power, Acts mentions him in power. Luke doesn't, but that's not the focus of the Gospel of Luke. So it could be, couldn't be, but it would have been a relevant piece of information. That's what we're looking for regarding omission. We have no mention of the martyrdom of apostles like John does. He specifically mentions Peter in the way he would die, so in future tense, but in a past perspective. John, of course, outlived all the apostles, but the apostle Paul was executed by Nero around the same time as each other. And that's, again, according to accounts you can read with us in the studies we did on the existence of Peter. But that's the sort of thing, even mentioning, say, for example, policies of Caligula, when he exiled the Jews from Rome on account of his own prejudices, and that right was ultimately taken away from them in the 50s. We could also note that as well being finalized in the 70s. All of this information is absent. So when it comes to this, and maybe other examples as well, Clement of Alexandria in his book Stromata, chapter 1, verse 21, said, and I quote, "To prove this is true regarding the point that he's making, it is written in the Gospel of Luke as follows." Now, Clement, he was alive in the 2nd century, and he's circulating, communicating this authoritative source. It's very early. And even noting our earliest complete copy would bear testimony to that. But the reason why, again, Luke is treated by early Christians and by itself, according to its own claims, as a writing based on previous material, it wasn't first. That's our most important argument here.
Luke.
Yeah, Luke.
But you are proposing evidence that would support an earlier date
Then John.
of writing of the Gospel of Luke, even by secular standards, but definitely before John.
Yeah, and even in the dates that would put it after 70 AD because of the unwillingness for, well, spoiler alert here, them to acknowledge things like predictive prophecy, they still have to acknowledge, so why then the absence of this kind of material? Why is it that Luke would be able to circulate this information when he was with Paul during his execution? Would Nero have just let him go? You have to justify those things. And when it comes down to it, we only have enough data to say it was more likely, there's more internal and external evidence to support it was probably written during his time in Ephesus, Corinth, or Rome, before his first appeal at Nero. And Nero reigned until the late 60s.
And that's not to suggest that Luke could not have borrowed information from Mark, because who was touring with Paul and Barnabas during Paul's first missionary journey? The author, John Mark. And that was around 48 AD. So he...
Oh, earlier than that,
well, that's when he departed. I'm sorry. That's when he bailed.
Yeah.
And then what does Paul tell Barnabas later? Bring John Mark. He's useful for me in ministry.
Yeah.
And, of course, Peter calls him his son. So he had an endearment, a relationship with Mark. And we understand that Mark was probably based on Peter's eyewitness account, his testimony,
which we get from the quotes we mentioned. And also you're referencing my son Mark, that's 2 Peter chapter 3, and 2 Timothy chapter 3 also makes that mention as well. John is useful for me and for ministry. So that's noting there was some reconciliation there.
So it's not hard to believe that there might be some source material with Mark in Luke, but that does not support the argument that Mark was written first of all the synoptics.
No, it just means that it was earlier than Luke, and we would 100% agree on that.
Because some do maintain that Mark was written after Matthew and Luke, and that's considered a conservative view. But you're putting it, you're basically saying that the order they're put in the Bible is based on early church testimony of
And-
when they were written,
and internal evidence.
and that still stands true today, even if scholars try to argue against that. There's solid evidence that no, the order that they're in the Bible is probably the order they were written in.
Yeah, and we have plenty of reason to believe it, but this is where we get into the meat. So now for the second earliest gospel, claimed to be the first by the majority of scholars today, the Gospel of Mark. Now, the Gospel of Mark, definitely early material. I would note it around mid to late 50s AD. Now, that's when, again, we could pretty much be certain it was being spread throughout the Roman Empire, and we don't think that, say, for example, Mark couldn't have written it early, kept it as private material, and then circulated it. It would be weird if he did that, given the evangelistic spirit of the early church, but that is a possibility. The reality is, though, when it comes to our dating in the 50s, it all centers around the internal evidence of the book of Acts. And by the way, I don't want to just say, well, the Bible says it, that settles it. Acts is not the book of Mark. Mark is not authoritative because it's all a chapter in a larger book, because this is not a single book. This is a collection of 66 books with 40 different authors, written in 3 different languages across 3 different continents over 1,500 years of human history. So if we're noting this as a compilation of material, I can reference Acts for data in order to verify Mark and not say, Mark says so, therefore that settles it. That would be stupid. But if, on the other hand, I take a step back and say, if we're taking the examination of evidence, it's not saying that I don't trust the Bible at face value. I do, but it's because it's proven itself trustworthy. The accounts in Acts can be taken as broad strokes history, even according to formerly skeptical scholars like Sir William Ramsay. He said, as an expert in the Roman Empire in his day, that Luke was a historian of the first rank when it came to the quality of information and what he emphasized as far as locations, individuals, titles in his account of Acts.
Things they didn't even know existed until archaeology dug them up in the last, 50 to 100 years.
Absolutely, and that is very good for our conversations with people. But in Acts chapter 12, this is again data separate from the Gospel of Mark. He notes, as you mentioned earlier, Adrian, that Mark was able to accompany Paul and Barnabas on their first missionary journey, and again in Acts chapter 15, verse 36, where he separated from them. We need to note that this was, as far as the second missionary journey is concerned, 49 AD. That is 100% certain according to those timelines in the account of the book of Acts, because when it was noting those specific people, places, and titles that they were traveling through the Greek Isles in, there is no question, because of such narrow margins like the magistrates.
48, 49 is when he would have bailed.
Yeah, the second missionary journey. Now, with that then as our kind of lighthouse, and we're going to be navigating around it, what do we know about this? Well, Acts chapter 12 and verse 25 mentions him by name. This is, of course, from the account. And Barnabas and Saul returned from Jerusalem when they had fulfilled their ministry, and also took with them John, whose surname was Mark. That's the Mark that we, of course, associate with the gospel according to Mark. Now, between these events, and of course, what led up to this was an attempted persecution and execution of the Apostle Peter and the successful execution of John's younger brother, we note that all of these events can, of course, be verified. When we get into Mark chapter 15, though, and this is after the First Council of Jerusalem, when we were discussing all of the controversy regarding the Gentiles, we are noting a 2 to 3 year gap. And when 49 AD is in fact where we're going to be starting and ending the conversation, Barnabas, who again, son of encouragement, that was his nickname, his birth name was different, he wanted to bring him along when, of course, you can fill in the gaps. Did he get scared in the tent and asked his mom to take him home? Was he worried about persecution? In a more adult and mature sense, it was ultimately set around those 2 major events in regards to the First Council of Jerusalem and the writing of Galatians. Now, Galatians, for those of you who are curious, is unanimous across the board with scholarship, the earliest book of the New Testament. It was addressing something that was taking place during this time, And of course, a controversy that's being addressed doesn't have to take place after when it was resolved. The controversy can persist, but the idea of it being at its peak and the language that Paul uses to address this so severely, notes before this point, and with Galatians almost being set into, some would argue, the late 30s, I'd say very, very early 40s, that event and the writing of Galatians, as well as Paul's missionary journeys in 1st and 2nd Thessalonians, where he had, just like we talked about with Luke, the opportunity to communicate from Corinth and Ephesus to Thessalonica, because it was only a 3-week journey by foot and a 3, well, maybe less, by sea. The idea was that this was addressing very early material. It was set at a time where Paul, of course, was in the danger of his life. He was on the run, didn't have the opportunity to write. When he was settled down, there's an open door. When, though, we note that very specific event of the second missionary journey being encouraged by the original apostles in Jerusalem, where are they? They're at a gathering of all of the major pillars of the Christian church. They are in the company of people who were witnesses of the resurrection of Jesus himself. See Luke, where he could have possibly gotten his material but not put into circulation yet. And also a connection, as we stated in our early quotes, Mark would have had direct access to the Apostle Peter. They were still in town. Peter hadn't gotten to his flight yet, to use the modern term. Now, assuming again that when Paul, and let me just read it, this is Acts chapter 15, verse 36, then after some days, that is after the apostles had dispersed, some days Paul said to Barnabas, "Let us go back and visit our brethren in every city where we have preached the word of the Lord, and see how they were doing." Now Barnabas was determined to take with them John called Mark, but Paul insisted that they should not take with them the one who had departed from them in Pamphylia. So we know the actual location where Mark gave up on the trip, and had not gone with them to the work. Then when the contention became so sharp, that's an account of embarrassment, by the way, so that they parted from one another, Barnabas took Mark and sailed to Cyprus. But Paul chose Silas and departed, being commended by the brethren to the grace of God, and went through Syria and Cilicia, strengthening the churches. So Paul goes to Greece. Barnabas goes to Cyprus. Now, Cyprus, interestingly enough, is where we kind of leave them off. It's not the last time they're mentioned in the gospel accounts, but it's where Paul's firsthand reports of all of these events starts to focus specifically on Paul. Now, why go to Cyprus? Well, again, they had begun to spread out and even move to Antioch in verse 34. But they're still able to get communication with the other apostles because they literally all just met with them. They could have asked Peter, "Where did you go?" This is speculation, but notice it fits the narrative. When Barnabas took Mark to Cyprus, that gives 2 questions for us to ask. Was the reason they went to Cyprus to strengthen the churches that they established there, or was it to meet with somebody? And that's, of course, where we say John likely had met Peter. Now, the early dates, what would put Mark as the earliest of all the gospel accounts without a doubt, is if at that point, within the next 5 years if possible, John Mark was able to not only put together all of that information, that the moment that Peter met him, he said, "Oh, hey, I've been needing a scribe, start taking this down right now," that they were able to produce that within a year, put that into circulation, and of course account for travel, resources, etc. So if, and this is the ultimately fork in the road for Mark and priority if you're not a biased atheist, of where or when this was super early or early enough to be alongside Matthew. Did Peter meet them immediately in Cyprus? Was that the reason they went there? And note, at that point, 48, 49 AD, very narrow window of time. When they got there, was that the first and only thing that Peter had Mark do, or was there a time period, very likely, where Mark was discipled by Peter, taught by Peter, built up in his relationship and encouraged, and then later on in their ministry together, as his disciple, was entrusted with this information? We don't know. But what's the more reasonable approach? That Mark was just thrown into this position as a scribe, or that was something that happened later? That's where the rubber meets the road. That's where the 2 opinions diverge. Also note as well that the tone for Mark and priority needs to be understood. If this is what's being put forward, that you insist that this was put into circulation, not just produced, but spread out within the next 5 years, Mark would, without a doubt, be the first gospel. But notice a lot of assumptions have to be made with it as well. So if that's in fact the case, we want to, of course, distance ourselves from the bad ones and saying, well, scholars say it, so they're right.
Yeah, that's not an argument.
Yeah, or say, well, Mark is the shortest, therefore it's right.
Yeah.
That's just misinformed. But when it comes to addressing the objections, the timeline that we'd get from Mark requires a bit more evidence to conclude it was first. But you could at least understand why people would say that, even among Christian circles, because of the data we get in Acts. Now, note as well, we can talk about external evidence and documents. It by no means is going to argue for or against whether or not Mark is late. But as far as the early books of Christianity, it was very closely associated with the first books of the New Testament, those being Galatians, 1st and 2nd Thessalonians, and Matthew, which is what we'll get into now. If you want to note, again, Mark's association with Peter and the reference to him being the second written, I'd recommend reading the writings of Papias in church history. Book 3, chapter 39 and verse 15 is the most definitive. And we also mentioned Origen's quote in ecclesiastical history before. But that's where we'd form the conclusion that this is all there.
What I find interesting about this is that many of the evidences that those who hold to a Markan priority are the same internal evidences that those who hold to Matthew being written first. It's the same argument. So see if I can summarize this and tell me if I've got this kind of right. So because Mark's stories are a little bit more expanded, when Luke and Matthew include a story from Mark, they diverge. So if they diverge in a detail, meaning they just didn't mention a certain detail, they tend to never agree with one another. But when Matthew and Luke do agree with one another, it's usually a story that's not in Mark. So the idea being that if they used Mark as source material, that would make sense. That, okay, when they're borrowing from Mark and they change a detail, if Mark was written later, they should be in agreement with those details, and Mark would have been the one to diverge. But because of the opposite being the case, that, oh, well, Mark said this, they changed it, but they don't agree with one another. So that's usually one of the reasons why New Testament scholars will look at that and say, okay, Mark probably was written first because it looks like materials being borrowed by these two other authors, and when they change details, they don't agree. They should agree. If there was a detail that was vice versa, where the Mark was relying on or writing independently, you would see it the other way. The other one was the language. Mark is apparently a very rough Greek and Aramaic phrases that are cleaned up and more theologically polished in Matthew and in Luke. And that's an argument to say, hey, this is an improvement upon Mark. Yeah, Mark did a good job writing his gospel. We're going to clean it up and include a bunch of things that Mark didn't include because we think this is very relevant. This was an early gospel because they wanted to get the story out as quickly as possible, and they didn't include all the stories. As those stories were being compiled, they were later on added to Matthew, not because they didn't happen or being made up, but just if you're going to tell a story, Pastor Scott's been editing a book for a pastor here in Tucson on the book of Revelation. And, I wrote a book and I had the same experience. You write what you want to write, you want what you say, and your editor starts hacking away at it. Like, we don't need this, we don't need that, we don't need this. So that's the big question is that what happened with Mark? Let's just get a shorter version out after Matthew's very, very expansive, very well-written version was out, and they just needed to hack it down? Or was the opposite true? Like, was Mark just the simple version? Give us the simple version. And so that's really the two of the arguments, I think. Is that right?
Yeah, and obviously both are complete nonsense when you suggest the actual assumption. It's that here, copy my homework, but don't make it obvious. Do a little bit of changes, which show that Matthew himself wasn't an eyewitness. Faulty assumption. And then the other,
I wouldn't draw that conclusion.
But this is the alternate theory where actual data that we have conflicts with the presumption. If you're saying this is a quotation, like we argued with Luke, who says that he's quoting prior sources, Mark for then to be the source material for Matthew, what need would there to have been for Matthew to quote a source earlier than him when he's an actual eyewitness himself?
Yeah, especially when you think of that in consideration of Luke. If Luke had access to these eyewitnesses, why would he go to Mark when he could have just
gone to Peter?
Yeah. Why would he go to Mark for his, because Mark was not an eyewitness, and so why would he do that? If he was trying to go to confirm sources, he wouldn't go to a non-eyewitness document unless he knew that was an eyewitness account.
Yeah, just like with Irenaeus, why go to Polycarp if John was still alive? Why go to Mark if Peter's still alive? But here's the real issue. If they're eyewitness testimony, Matthew can recall on his own memory as a source. If they're reporting the same events, why would you phrase them differently unless you don't understand that Greek is not the same thing as English? English has a very broad way of saying the same thing in many different ways. Greek doesn't have that problem. It is very specific and very direct in the things it tries to communicate. When you're, of course, speaking in Aramaic, this is many of the cases for Matthew quoting from the Hebrew scriptures in the Septuagint, that's different. But when it comes to the nature of the Greek language, people like Bart Ehrman should be absolutely, you can't disbar him because he's not a lawyer, but should be called out for that because he knows better. And this is the point. Language matters. The nature of eyewitness testimony matters, and Matthew himself was an eyewitness. So let's finish with that with the time we have left. Matthew, I'd put in the mid-50s, and the reason for that's fairly straightforward. The unanimous reports and consensus of early Christians quote it not only more than any other gospel, but as we saw from Origen, treat it as the first of the gospels. The main evidence for this is references that we see in the Didache, dated to 95 AD, where Matthew 6, 15 through 13, or 5 through 13, the Lord's Prayer is cited. First Clement, another early source we cited earlier in chapter 13 and verse 2, also in the 90s, quotes it. The Epistle of Barnabas, not the Gospel of Barnabas. The Epistle of Barnabas, 4:14, quotes Matthew 22:14. Ignatius quotes Matthew often, and his letter to the Ephesians, chapter 14 and verse 2. His letter to Smyrna in 6:1, and Polycarp, his letter to his teacher in chapter 2 and verse 2, which were both dated to the early hundreds. Polycarp's letter to the Philippians quotes all the synoptic Gospels, which show they were in circulation at this time and more, but most importantly noting that every single church father treats this as the first. That's why we would say. And
it was the most widely used, it's an apostle, has the most patristic significance, and also has the most, had the most time to circulate. So, I'm with you, Sean, as far as the order. But if you want to ask more questions about that, feel free to chime in later on this week. Thanks for tuning in. Happy Monday. God bless you.
You've been listening to A Reason for Hope. Thank you again for joining us as we continue our journey through God's Word, one question of the heart at a time. Until we meet again, we would love to connect with you. You can text or email your questions to questionsforhope@gmail.com. You can also find out more about our ministry at calvarychristianfellowship.com. And be sure to join us next time on A Reason for Hope. A Reason for Hope is an outreach ministry of Calvary Christian Fellowship in Tucson, Arizona.